give his greetings to our Ciampi lecturer, Professor Ambrosio.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. I am very happy to spend a few words on the occasion of the inaugural event of the Carlo Azeglio Ciampi lectures, which will be given by the Ciampi visiting scholars, and I welcome all the scholars who are already in Florence. By the way, tomorrow I will also be with you on the occasion of the event organized with Banca d'Italia. So let me just say that I'm very happy to see that the Istituto Carlo Azeglio Ciampi now is running, is a perfectly running machine. Now is in its maturity, let me say, from the beginning of the last few years. And I was looking also at the topics of this series of seminars, which are going to take place in November. Of course, there are many very hot topics, let me say, at the interface between economic, politics, and also other areas. So I'm sure that they will attract the interest of many scholars. So let's enjoy this seminar, and a special welcome, of course, to Professor Zeitlin, who will talk about experimental governance within and beyond the European Union, retrospect and prospects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luigi. If I can introduce our speaker for today, Professor Jonathan Zeitlin is one of the most prominent figures in the study of socioeconomics and of governance in a transatlantic way. His career has crossed the Atlantic several times. He studied at Harvard, at Cambridge, at Warwick. He worked in the UK. He worked for many years as a professor at Wisconsin-Madison, and then in this century at the University of Amsterdam. He has had many important roles and recognition. In particular, has been Jamonet Chair of EU and Transnational Governance, which is a very prominent professorship funded by the European Commission. He has also been president of the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics, of which he has been one of the promoters over the last couple of decades, one of the most lively scholarly communities in the study of institutions, economy, and society. In terms of intellectual interests, it comes from the study more of industrial relations, of the economy. Has been one of the most important scholars in the study of post-Fordism, of the alternatives to mass productions in particular, and of flexibility, a topic that emerged in the 1980s and hasn't left us since then. And anybody who's interested in flexibility should go back and read the classics by Jonathan and by Charles Sable on that. Over the years, then, he started studying more and more also social policies and European Union governance on social policies, and from the experiment of European Union social governance, which was one of the prominent fields in which new forms of policy making were tested in the 90s and 2000, that is benchmarking, soft law, and so on. Then he started studying also other fields of policy making at the European Union level, in particular, more recently, the environment. In this, well, he's been one of several American scholars who have made the biggest contribution in the understanding of the European Union. It's quite striking that some of the important research centers on Europe are in America, and many of the most important scholars of Europe are in America. And there is a certain tendency for American observers of Europe to be slightly more complimentary towards the European Union than we citizens of these things are. Whether this is because they have a broader perspective, because they don't pay all the consequences of what the European Union does, it depends, but certainly it is a very important intellectual contribution that allows us to see us in the mirror of what American political science and American sociology can do. Just to mention two recent books that Jonathan has edited that are very much on the topic of today and on the issue of European governance, European Union beyond the polycrisis, and European Union socio-economic governance since the crisis. Okay, a lot of crises. Jonathan has been one of those who has made popular the term polycrisis, the combination of, well, every day there is a new one, if you read the news, so I'm not going even to list them. But thank you very much, Jonathan. He's our visiting scholar in the Carlo Azeglio Ciampi Institute, which is now starting to run at full speed and which will be with us in the next few weeks and months with a number of very important lectures, conferences, seminars, and so on. So I'm very grateful for Jonathan to be here. And after his lecture, we have also two discussants. I don't think I have to spend a lot of words to say who they are. Manuela Moschella is a professor in international political economy, and David Natali from the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna is also a professor of political science and expert of European Union policy making. They will give some feedback on Jonathan's lecture. So welcome, Jonathan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Do I need to turn this on? No. I think it's on now. Can people hear me? I'm going to stand up now. I want to make a slideshow. Okay. I'm not autonomous in this matter, but I can advance the slides in the usual way. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Guglielmo, for the kind introduction. Also, putting my career in perspective. Thanks as well to Mario Pianta for the invitation to kick off this series of seminars, and also director of the school for introducing and indirectly sponsoring my stay. It's a real pleasure after having been, let's say, around the Scuola for some months now to have a chance to present. And I'm going to give a rather broad talk, which in some way gives an overview not only of developments in the world, but in my own research, and then looks forward to new research directions. So the talk will be organized in three parts. First, I'm going to give you a kind of conceptual introduction to experimentalist governance. Then I'm going to discuss some theoretical and empirical extensions from, let's say, the original core as it developed 10 or 15 years ago, focusing on the relationship between scope conditions and architectural variants. And then I'm going to talk about research challenges and strategies, and what I call an iterative, abductive approach. And in some ways, also because we have not only colleagues but students here, I hope that that can give some inspiration for students who might be thinking about how can you use this kind of approach in your own research. I'm going to say less about the normative issues and challenges connected to experimentalism. That is a whole, I mean, it's a connected, but would be a different discussion, but I'm happy to take up questions of a normative character in the discussion. Okay, let me start by saying that we are experiencing broad transformations transnationally of governance. One important Among these is the widespread emergence of a novel form of experimentalist governance. And I want to underline experimentalist and not experimental. We now use the acronym XG, and I may, if I start feeling pressed for time, start to use that. We can see this across multiple levels and locations within and beyond the nation state. So from the provision of local public services, youth care, special education, all the way to the regulation of global trade. So things like the safety and sustainability of food, of forests, of the protection of the ozone layer. And there are, we can say there are robust examples in many jurisdictions in the EU, in the US, and other developed democracies, in transnational regimes. It's quite stimulating, but I would say controversial literature about policy experimentation and experimentalism in China. But I'm not going to go into that in this talk. Okay, so broadly speaking, we can see experimentalism as a widespread response to volatility and uncertainty. So think about the increasing complexity and volatility of the decision-making environment has broadly reduced the capacity of all kinds of actors to anticipate future states of the world and calculate the consequences of their actions, even in a probabilistic sense. And this is what has been called Knightian uncertainty. Frank Knight, who was a Chicago economist in the interwar period, made a very important distinction between risk and uncertainty here. And, you know, it would be a whole another lecture to talk about why do we experience this increase in uncertainty in the world. Today, as a kind of shorthand, we can say that it's a consequence of globalization, of the acceleration of technological innovation, and also of the diversification of populations within states and households as well, among a series of other interconnected developments. But whatever the causes, we can say that this condition of increased uncertainty has overwhelmed the capacities of conventional hierarchical governance in many settings. And so the claim here is that we live in a world in which, not everywhere, but in many areas, precise policy goals and methods for achieving them can't be reliably determined in advance, but must instead be discovered and rediscovered in the course of practical problem solving. So we can define experimentalist governance as a recursive process based on iterated formulation and revision of framework goals, of plans and rules, through learning from comparative review of implementation efforts in different local contexts. My friend Joel Rogers, who is also from Wisconsin, is also both an important governance scholar and policy actor, always used to say that, you know, you should be able to reduce any politically useful claim to something that can fit on a car bumper sticker. This isn't there yet, unfortunately. Okay, we can also, at a more theoretical level, see experimentalist governance as a form of pragmatism in action. So governance processes of the type I'm describing are experimentalist in a philosophical sense, and here the inspiration comes from the work of John Dewey and other American pragmatists. So pragmatists in the sense that governance processes systematically provoke doubt about their own assumptions and practices. They treat all solutions as provisional and corrigible. They use the local knowledge of frontline actors to correct higher level goals and rules, and the broader review of these frontline actors' efforts to correct local plans in light of experience elsewhere. So it's a kind of reciprocal interaction between local and central actors. And the result is to produce an ongoing reciprocal adjustment of ends and means through comparing different approaches to advancing common goals. Okay, now let me talk about the architecture of experimentalist governance. It'll start to become a little bit more concrete. In its classic and its most developed form, XG typically involves a cycle of 4 functional steps or elements organized as an iterative and scalable multi-level architecture. And you'll see through the slides that there are quite a few references, and that is not only to help people find the basis for what I have to say, but to emphasize that this body of research is really a collective, collaborative project. I mean, Guglielmo mentioned Charles Sable, with whom I first collaborated on flexible production back in the 1980s. And I would say I have followed him and his colleagues into the analysis of flexible, revisable forms of governance. So there is really a direct affiliation between these two literatures. And here is a kind of diagram which shows you experimentalism as an iterative multi-level architecture in which you start out by some combination of central and local units jointly establishing framework goals, rules, metrics. Then the second step is that there is some element of discretionary implementation by lower level units. These can be public, they can be private, they can be hybrid. And so they adapt the general goals and rules to their own local circumstances. But in exchange for this kind of relative autonomy, they also have obligations to report regularly their progress, to participate in some kind of peer or non-hierarchical review in which their efforts are compared to those of others who are trying to do the same broad things but in different ways, and where they're not making good progress towards the agreed goals according to the metrics, they're expected to come up with plausible plans for improvement which are informed by the experience of their peers. The fourth element or phase in the process is periodic revision of the central goals, metrics, and procedures. So it's not only the local actors who are expected to adapt, but also the central ones. And then, the cycle, or hopefully a spiral of continuous improvement goes on. Okay, now I have to add one very important element to this architectural account of experimentalism. That is that these architectures are often underpinned by what we call penalty defaults. These are mechanisms for inducing reluctant parties to cooperate by threatening to impose sufficiently unattractive alternatives. So in the European Union, penalty defaults frequently involve court judgments or commission decisions which oblige member states and or private actors to explore how to pursue their preferred goals in ways which are compatible with the principles of European law, but without imposing specific hierarchical solutions. And that's how it differs from much classic judicial review, for example. In a transnational context, these penalty defaults often involve some threats of exclusion from key markets through some kind of combination of multilateral sanctions, unilateral regulations, and private consumer boycotts. Now, I think it's important to underline that in these kinds of transnational regimes, including within the European Union, such exclusion threats are typically accompanied by a form of capacity building support to assist weaker actors in meeting the required standards. So I'll just give one example. In the Montreal protocol for protection of the ozone layer where all kinds of actors, including developing countries, are expected to phase out chemicals, substances that harm the ozone layer, and they're not allowed to put them into transnational trade, subject to various kinds of penalties. There is also assistance from a multilateral fund, which helps them to meet the adjustment costs. So there's both advice, but also financial support. And I think that's also quite important. Okay, now to kind of conclude this initial section, I want to talk about what I would call the salient virtues of experimentalism. Here we get more not only into the positive, but also to the normative dimension. Okay, first of all, accommodation of diversity. So this is a governance style that adapts general goals to varied local contexts instead of imposing one-size-fits-all solutions. And nobody likes one, if you put it that way, nobody likes one size. Secondly, it's a framework for coordinated learning through disciplined comparison of different approaches to advancing broad common goals. Thirdly, and I think this is definitely a normative point, it can be understood as a dynamic accountability mechanism for shared commitments based on mutual monitoring and peer review. And it can also be used by publics, not only by the policy actors directly involved in the process. And finally, as I've already said, it's corrigible by design. So problems identified in one phase of implementation can be corrected in the next iteration. You don't have to be able to plan everything correctly in advance. From the point of view of debates about the capacity of public institutions, this is a more forgiving kind of approach. Okay, now scope conditions and extensions. Okay, the most important scope condition, which I've already mentioned, is strategic uncertainty. This means policy actors don't know their precise or can't define their precise goals and how best to achieve them ex ante. Second, and also very important, is what we can call a multipolar or polyarchic distribution of power. That means that no single actor is able to impose their preferred solutions without taking account of others' views. Let me just clarify any misunderstandings. That doesn't mean that all actors have equal power, which of course would. Thirdly, diversity, and this is quite connected to strategic uncertainty, but perhaps it's worth separating it out. So the more diverse the environment, the more difficult to identify universal solutions and impose and enforce uniform rules. And finally, some measure of interdependence. Cohen, in writing with Sable and de Burca, calls it complex interdependence, using older vocabulary. The point here is there must be sufficient interdependence to motivate a search for joint solutions to common problems. Otherwise, different jurisdictions can learn from each other, but they don't necessarily need to build a joint governance process in order to advance their common goals. And what I would say here is that on each of these dimensions, an intermediate level of scope conditions fosters experimentalism in the classic architectural form I showed you earlier. So there should be neither too little nor too much of each. And I'll explain to you in a moment how that matters. Okay, so the first extension that I want to talk about is a new architectural variant which combines synchronic uniformity with diachronic experimentalism. So if we have high interdependence coupled with high uncertainty, there are cases where we see a concern for the integrity of integrated markets has led to the creation of a single set of harmonized but provisional rules, which are revisable through ongoing review of local implementation experience. That is what I call a simplified experimentalist architecture, because there's fewer steps to it than the four-step cycle. In these architectures, the framework, rules, and procedures may be progressively specified, and the discretion for lower-level actors at any given moment may be narrowed, but the rules and procedures themselves remain contestable in light of local application. And revisions based on learning from comparative review of implementation experience provide a crucial source of improvement and adaptability for the system as a whole. And the examples that have been most studied so far are EU electricity and banking regulation. So I'm going to go a little more depth into the example of the single supervisory mechanism for EU banking union that I've recently written a study of. This mechanism, known as the SSM, is attached to the European Central Bank and was created following the global financial and euro crises to break up the cozy relationship between banks and national supervisors, which was thought. In this system, the European Central Bank has final authority over banking licenses within the Eurozone. It directly supervises the largest banks, known as significant institutions, and can take over supervision of so-called less significant institutions from national competent authorities where necessary. And if you look at its design and its activities, you can see that the SSM seeks to enforce uniform rules, standards, and procedures across the banking union, and this is considered necessary to avoid regulatory arbitrage and ensure a level playing field. And this is what I call synchronic uniformity, so the rules at any one time. Turns from her work on international. Now here's the other side, though, which not as widely understood. So all major decisions of the SSM must be approved by its supervisory board, and there the national competent authorities, or NCAs, hold the overwhelming majority of the votes. All major initiatives and policies, including the supervisory model itself, are developed through joint ECB national networks based on deliberative comparison of national practices. The large banks, the significant institutions, are overseen by so-called joint supervisory teams of ECB and national officials, supported by a central benchmarking service, and this combines deep local knowledge with a broad comparative perspective. Rules, practices, and methodologies of the SSM are regularly revised through ongoing peer review by mixed groups of ECB and national officials, and this at multiple levels. Very importantly, the frontline supervisors can and do regularly propose revisions based on their local implementation experience, and these are often taken up centrally. So all of this reflects the SSM's efforts to adapt its rules, methods, and procedures to banks' diverse business models and to update them rapidly in response to changing markets and technology. So this is why I call it a system of diachronic experimentalism. Now, is this a more general model? We found a similar architecture combining uniform, detailed rules made and revised experimentally in EU electricity regulation. Both these cases, banking and electricity, support the view that under conditions of high interdependence coupled with high uncertainty, uniform rules and practices can be accepted as effective and legitimate by member states, provided that they're applied in contextually sensitive ways and regularly revised through deliberative procedures in which national officials themselves participate. And so you might think that uniformity and experimentalism, as I presented them, would be antithetical. But these cases suggest instead that actually diachronic experimentalism may be a necessary condition for synchronic uniformity of regulation within a diverse polity like the EU. And together with my former postdoc, Bernardo Rangoni, we're exploring this conjecture through ongoing research on other policy domains, especially competition policy and pharmaceutical regulation. Let me show you how variations in scope condition lead to another architectural variant. This time, I want to go into the transnational or global dimension. In principle, experimentalism is well suited to transnational domains. As we know, there's no overarching sovereign to impose and enforce common goals and rules. And the diversity of local conditions makes uniform fixed rules even less feasible than in domestic settings. But the very polyarchy and diversity that make experimentalist governance attractive can also make it difficult to get a transnational regime off the ground. So too many participants with sharply different views can make it hard to reach initial agreement on common goals. A single powerful player may be able to veto other proposed solutions, even if they... Oh, this is commonplaces of international relations and global governance literature. But in such cases, transnational experimentalist regimes can also be assembled or joined up piece by piece from loosely coupled regime complexes through a variety of pathways and mechanisms. Let me give one example, and this is the transnational timber legality regime. Now again, it's well known there's no overarching global forest governance regime, and this is more than 30 years after the failure of proposals for a binding forest convention at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. But I want to argue that something like a joined-up transnational regime with pronounced experimentalist features has nonetheless emerged over the past decade through productive or positive sum interactions between multiple public and private initiatives across geographic regions and levels of governance. This is centered around the EU's so-called Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade, or FLEGT initiative for combating illegal logging and promoting sustainable forest governance. And I've argued that this initiative itself has a classic experimentalist architecture. Now, if I say a joined up transnational theme, what am I talking about? What do I mean? In what sense? And here there are four elements I want to underline. First, a growing convergence around a shared problem definition and accompanying norms, principles, and framework goals for combating illegal logging. Secondly, the diffusion of mutually reinforcing and often cross-referencing rules and standards across jurisdictions and schemes, both public and private. Thirdly, the progressive institutionalization of practical cooperation and coordination to advance these goals, including information sharing, alignment of regulatory approaches, collaborative training, and enforcement activity. And finally, we also see within these forms of collaboration an increase in focus on monitoring, review, and revision of practices, procedures, and programs at multiple levels, and here again, informed by experimentalist comparison of implementation experience across jurisdictions and schemes. And together with colleague and former student Christine Overdevest, we've analyzed articles. Okay, what are the key mechanisms for joining up this particular regime? Here I think we can say some of them are distinctively experimentalist, but aren't. So one is what the Israeli legal scholar Oren Perez has called ensemble regulation. So that is normative and enforcement externalities which are created by cross-referencing rules and standards across private certification and public regulation. Secondly, recursive learning through peer review of implementation experience. within enforcement networks. Thirdly, public oversight and review of private certification and national legality verification schemes with a focus on what has been called benchmarking for equivalence. So looking at the extent to which, even in different ways, these schemes may be able to, that may have common goals and achieve equivalence. Equivalence is also, assessment is also prominent in food safety, in its standards beyond its own borders. Finally, there's the penalty default effect of the EU timber regulation and other public timber legality regulations on third country exporters and multinational corporations. And here we can say that there is also a role for multilateral institutions and goals. They can be a key source of legitimacy for what Joanne Scott has called contingent unilateralism, unilateral up until there's a possibility of getting the standard embodied multilaterally, or what Hoekman and Sable have called open plurilateral agreements. And this can be used as a basis, a source of legitimacy for penalty. Now, one last extension. So we've talked about extensions which are linked to variations in scope conditions at any one moment. What about temporal variability? And you might think that experimentalist governance could be self-limiting. Now, I've emphasized strategic uncertainty as a key scope condition. Together with Bernardo Rangoni, we explored this through an empirical analysis of the evolution over 25 years of the EU electricity regulation regime. And the conclusion that we came to is that this case supports the view that experimentalism is self-reinforcing rather than self-limiting, though other outcomes are possible. Here I'll show you a diagram. So we start with strategic uncertainty. We have four pathways here. One pathway is that, as an experimentalist governance scheme going and solves problems, it could reduce uncertainty. And then the actors might want to revert to hierarchical governance. A second possibility, which I'm calling 3 here, is that strategic uncertainty might become more narrowly focused. In other words, you have a better understanding of the broad approach, but then you're uncertain about precisely how to apply it. We call this nested experimentalism. And the third broad outcome, which again, 4 here, is that the actors come to recognize that strategic uncertainty is pervasive, it's not going to go away, so they build a multi-purpose experimentalist architecture which they can do problems as they arrive. The fourth, which here is shown as second, is that even after there may have been some reversion to hierarchical governance, there could be an unexpected reemergence of strategic uncertainty, and the actors might stumble back into experiment. Ronja de Burca, who's now at the EY, proposed that is that experimentalist regimes may not always be consciously designed, but they may emerge as actors discover that governance provisions which were designed for another purpose can be reoriented to help deal. So here we have, one self-limiting pathway and 3 self-reinforcing ones. And what we found broadly is that in the electricity case, we have examples of 3 and 4, these 2, but none of 1, and since none of 1, also none of 2. Now, Another possibility that policy actors might deliberately seek to reduce instead of adapt to strategic uncertainty. And so they might prefer hierarchical rather than experimentalist governance architectures, even where these already exist. And so one example that I'm studying myself now and working with a PhD on as well is the EU deforestation regulation. The regulation, which was adopted last year, focuses on reducing the union's deforestation footprint by excluding agricultural commodities produced on recently deforested or degraded land from the EU market through imposing mandatory due diligence for importers. It hasn't attracted so much attention outside the world of people who study forests and environment, but in terms of the obligations that it imposes on large multinational trading and producing companies and countries. Now, the governance arrangements are designed to reduce uncertainty for businesses and national authorities by relying on standard international definitions, for example, of deforestation, on external satellite data, and unilateral risk benchmarking. So the Commission rate each country as high standard or low risk for deforestation. And there are different inspection and supervision regimes depending on how you. The original Commission proposal, which was produced by one Director General for the Environment, also envisaged abolishing the flagged voluntary partnerships, despite acknowledging that they've improved forest governance in producer countries. They take too much time. They involve too many resources. They're too slow in producing the outcomes. The unilateral approach was preferred. Now here, I want to bring in another of the scope conditions, which can have a counteracting effect, and that is polyarchy. So studying the policy process in the EU, we find pushbacks from NGOs, from the European Parliament, from member states, from partner countries outside the EU, and also from other Directorate Generals within the Commission, led to amendments to the original Commission proposal, preserving the voluntary partnership agreements, and mandating a strategic framework for partnerships with producer countries in implementing the regulation. So what I conclude from this is that the polyarchic distribution of power in the EU's own decision-making processes thus blocked unilateral efforts to move to a fully hierarchical governance architecture. It now remains to be seen how far collaboration with producer countries in implementing the EUDR will give rise to new experimentalist partnerships aimed at tackling the root causes of deforestation. Having clean supply chains for the EU doesn't necessarily improve the climate or tackle the root causes of deforestation. For that, you have to engage with the actors on the ground. And the first example in this direction is a joint task force which has been set up by the Commission with the Indonesian and Malaysian governments on transparency and traceability of supply chains. And we can say that the producer countries are very upset about this approach, which the Brazilian ambassador to the EU has called punitive, discriminatory, and illegitimate. So that is another form of polyarchy at work here. Okay, now I want to move to the third and final part of my talk, which is about how do we study these. And clearly, maybe some of you are already thinking this, there are a lot of research challenges. Because of its complex variant architectures, contextual adaptations, and iterative temporal dynamics, experimentalist governance does not lend itself to standard large N research methods like the construction of quantitative indices or scoreboards, nor is it well suited to box-ticking qualitative exercises. Certainly plenty of people have been tempted to say, okay, here are these 4 elements of the classic architecture. Are they present? Tick the box. Are they missing? No. Nor does experimentalist governance lend itself to medium N methods, like qualitative comparative analysis, or QCA, whether in its crisp or fuzzy set form. And the reason is that the truth table scores, from which configurations of necessary and sufficient conditions in this methodology are derived, may actually change over time through comparative review and recursive revision of local practices and central goals, metrics, and procedures in light of one another. And it's well known that QCA works with basically a fixed corpus of cases, and as soon as you go outside of it, then the truth table is no longer true. Okay, so for researching experimentalist governance, there's thus no substitute for in-depth case studies or in-depth studies of specific cases using a combination of qualitative methods such as interviewing, participant observation, and documentary analysis to study the operation of governance architectures in action, identify the key mechanisms of work, and trace their evolution over time. The whole thrust of research here has been moving away from the initial focus on architectures on paper, which are easy to test, to architectures in action. Require you to typically office and get out into the world. Now, this kind of what I call contextualized process tracing, I think something David addressed, is essential to eliminate false positives. So cases which at first glance seem to resemble the classic experimentalist architecture, especially the first 2 steps, which you can find all over, but which on closer inspection turn out to lack some of the key features, especially the recursive feedback from comparative review of implementation, experience through revision of local practices, and central procedures. So I wanted to say, is there a differentia specifica of experimentalist governance? It's those steps, the 3rd and 4th steps, not the first. But this kind of process tracing is no less essential to eliminate false negatives and identify new architectural variants. And this is true of the case of the single supervisory mechanism, which has widely, but I think erroneously, been considered an example of centralized hierarchical governance. And certainly when I first read about it, that's what I thought. Actually, it took master's students at the University of Amsterdam who went out and interviewed the actors to draw my attention that there was something more interesting. Okay, now what about generalization? Indispensable through though such in-depth case studies are to researching experimentalism, they're not in themselves sufficient to support its theoretical claims about broader transformations of contemporary governance. So if we follow a kind of Bayesian logic, process tracing case studies like the one that I just told you about on the evolution of EU electricity regulation, they can enhance confidence in theoretical claims like that experimentalist governance is self-reinforcing rather than self-limiting, but they certainly can't prove them definitively. So extending the generalizability of these findings would thus require further process tracing analyses at a similar level of granularity across other policy domains within and beyond the EU, followed by systematic cross-case comparisons. And similarly, identification of promising new forms of experimentalist governance or variant architectures offers what we could call initial proofs of concept, which are suggestive of broader possibilities, but then their incidence and relevance to contemporary governance need to be investigated through further case studies and comparative mapping exercises. Given the thorny problems of causal inference in studying experimentalist governance, what about experimental methods, which, as I think you know, are increasingly seen as a gold standard for social science research? And there are a few studies of experimentalism methods. I'll only talk about one of them, but I can passion. One study that uses experimental methods to explore the potential contribution of experimentalism to improve governance is a study which I did with colleagues at the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, in which we used a pair of linked survey experiments in 6 member states to analyze public attitudes to the reform of EU pesticides regulation. Newspapers, but the reauthorization of glyphosate is high politics and not just, let's say, members of comitology committees, but ministers are being drawn into the discussion of whether the Commission's proposal for a 10-year renewal should be accepted. I think, actually, the Appeals Committee may be meeting today. So in our study, we found that systematic post-authorization monitoring and review of pesticides with the possibility of withdrawing them from the market in case of unanticipated negative effects had by far the strongest impact on respondents' support for a randomized package of reform measures. And I was actually pleasantly surprised by this. I put this in as the one experimentalist component in a package of measures, and it proved to be the most significant in this sample of 9,000 respondents to support a particular random package. And inclusion of this experimentalist measure in the proposed decision-making procedure also enhanced respondents' willingness to accept a hypothetical authorization decision, in this case, glyphosate, which is what we asked, opposed to their prior expressed preference. Now, what I want to draw your attention to here is that the experimental design of our study sheds, we think, convincing light on the potential contribution of post-authorization monitoring and review to rebuilding public support for EU pesticides regulation. But it's the design and implementation of these methods which could be expected to do the real work of improving governance outcomes. So it's not that the trials really help us find the message. So given these challenges of combining depth and breadth, a promising strategy for researching experimentalist governance involves an iterative, abductive cycle between in-depth case studies and systematic comparative mapping. Now, this kind of approach can start at either end of the spectrum. So you could begin with a broad comparative mapping of governance arrangements in a specific policy domain. To choose another one that I've worked on recently, provision of capacitating social care services. And then you can zoom in on promising cases for deeper study. And we found one case that we consider to be very promising and have written up, which is youth care in the Dutch city of Utrecht. And then, of course, you can zoom out again on the basis of the insights which you gain to the wider comparative picture. But you can do it in the opposite way. You can start with the promising case study, which you might stumble into. So this iterative research strategy, which resembles the architecture of experimentalist governance itself, follows what has been called an abductive logic, which was developed by an earlier pragmatist philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, in which theoretical propositions inspired by empirical observation are then elaborated or systematized deductively and tested inductively in a cyclical process of what Peirce called inference to the best, we add provisional explanation. Okay, now I want to give you one last example, and then I'm going to stop, and thanks for your patience. So the perspective example, that is something that I have not yet studied, but hope to study, is experimentalist regulation of uncertain risks. So here, look at post-market or post-authorization monitoring, incident notification, and rapid alert systems, which have proliferated in the EU and the US and other advanced economies across a variety of sectors in recent years. And initial studies suggest that these systems, which use the concrete experience of mitigation efforts to clarify incomplete understandings of potential hazards and continuously improve the measures taken to address them, represent a promising response to the challenges of regulating increasingly uncertain risk. Obviously, uncertain risk sounds a bit like an oxymoron because it blurs the Knightian distinction between risk and uncertainty. And in an ideal world, in fact, that's what's used. So we qualify that by certain risk. So by complementing ex-ante review of such risks with systematic ex-post monitoring of their practical incidence, these experimentalist forms of regulation make initial decisions less fateful, and they offer a promising route to unblocking what I think is widely agreed to be a stalled debate on the so-called precautionary principle within and beyond the EU. Now here, and I'm not going to take you through this, a little chart that I produced on what I think are the most significant and promising post-market monitoring, incident notification, and rapid alert systems. I've talked only about the ones which you find in the EU and its member states and the US, but they're also, in a number of cases, they link up to broader systems. Pharmaceutical regulation is a particularly interesting one because it has a practice called pharmacovigilance, now integrated into the authorization of drugs, but which involves systematic monitoring possible adverse side effects, and then typically feeding that back into the classes of patient and the conditions who followed the development of the anti-COVID vaccines will have seen how that kind of pharmacovigilance worked. Audit committees of the European Medicines Agency and also their Now, such experimentalist systems of post-market monitoring can also help to rebuild public support for regulatory decision-making on controversial and politicized issues, and this is something take also from the findings of the EU pesticide survey experiments earlier. Now, despite their broad significance for contemporary governance, academic research on these experimentalist forms of risk regulation remains surprisingly limited. Granular accounts are more often found in practitioner journals and reports than in social science. Again, if there are students in the audience who are looking for research topics, there are quite a few promising ones here. So systematic research on this phenomenon might therefore begin with a broad comparative mapping exercise aimed at identifying wider patterns and leading cases for an in-depth study by a large-scale collaborative. I haven't given up the idea of possibly organizing such a large-scale. The goal of a project of this type would be to chart and understand differences as well as commonalities in regulatory arrangements across sectors and jurisdictions. Start from the conjecture that the intensity of recursive monitoring and review may depend on the degree of interdependence or the tightness of coupling between the units concerned on the one hand and the potential gravity of a major safety failure on the other hand. Last slide. Such a comparative analysis would also serve a diagnostic function aimed at identifying missing or underdeveloped elements in risk regulation systems. A review of critical incidents and ensuing revision of safety guidance to individual units, which can provide input into ongoing policy debates. And I personally participate very regularly in giving policy wanted, sometimes unwanted, especially in the EU, but also in the past at the local. But research on this topic could likewise begin with in-depth analysis of individual promising cases, for example, pharmacovigilance in the EU, to understand better their core operating mechanisms before moving outwards to broader cross-sectoral and cross-national comparisons. And this, of course, reflects the iterative, recursive architecture of experimentalist governance itself. So theory and practice, subject and object here, to hope to do some more. Thanks very much for your patience, and I look forward to the comments and to the discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan, for this very clear, very comprehensive and rich presentation that covered both a new analytical perspective and the new, insights on which methods and which methodology can be applied to study this and apply these analytical tools, plus a really impressive curiosity about all sorts of policy fields. So while the climate crisis stays in the background, I would give the floor to our discussant first, Manuela Moschella, please.
First of all, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here and being asked to serve as a discussant today for at least two reasons. I've always learned a lot from Jonathan's works, presentations, and also personal advice, I have to say. And second, and I think it's also for our PhD student, I think it's always a privilege to hear of a theory, of a theoretical framework from its true source, right? And here, there are no doubt that Jonathan is the true source behind this idea of experimentalist governance. So thank you, Jonathan, for having been here with us today.
At least one of the sources.
One of the sources, for sure. One of the architects, since we're talking about architectures here. And I really want to stress that by bringing to the surface this idea of experimentalist governance, Jonathan and his co-authors have really challenged the traditional way to think about governance. They've also applied it to a variety of policy domains, as you have heard, so from electricity to financial regulation, deforestation. So they've really proved that it's not a sporadic thing. It's really a general pattern out there. I also think that they have done a lot of service, and this is something that Guglielmo already foreshadowed in his introduction. They did a lot of service to the EU, right? I'm sure that there are many folks in Brussels that are grateful to you, because you prove at least that the motto, united in diversity, can actually be true, right? Despite the skeptics. I know that the jury's still out there, but at least you gave them hope, right? Let's put it like that. Now, I know that my task today is not here to praise Jonathan's excellent works. I'm also here to help spark a collective conversation. So in this spirit, let me share 4 major reactions with you. And some are more provocations, some are more substantive points. And my 4 reactions have to do with what I wrote down as the unspoken assumption behind, this experimentalist governance, or probably a not sufficiently spoken assumption. The question of time, polyarchy as a scope condition, and probably a missing scope condition with a question mark. So let me share with you this reaction. Now, Jonathan, I think you can check me if I'm wrong, but going through your works and to this idea of experimentalist governance, there is kind of this undertone that experimentalist governance is good somehow, right? Is at least better than other formal governance in dealing with the problems at hand. I don't want to use the word more efficient. I leave it to the economist's efficiency, but at least, there is this idea that, experimentalist governance is good, is a good thing. You also mentioned it in some of your initial slides. You said that, experimentalist governance is more accountable somehow, is corrigible by design. So it really conveys this positive undertone. And in your latest work, when you mentioned, the work in 2023 based on the survey, you move also in this direction to test, this kind of assumption. So you want to know if really, this experimentalist governance can bring about better, governance outcomes. But, as a reader, I found this good assumption as at least problematic in 2 ways. The first is a theoretical point, right? Because if I get it correctly, the experimentalist governance framework is by design unstable, right? There is no equilibrium because you have, one equilibrium at the moment, but then there are the actors that implement certain rules. They change it through revisions and they arrive at another equilibrium, which is unstable on its own because then the cycle starts again. Everything is provisional, right? As you also say in your definition of experimentalist governance, it is a recursive process of provisional goal setting and revision, where provisional is the key word. But so if this is the state of unstable equilibrium, right? And, as someone that has also been trained as an economist, we like equilibrium much more than unstable equilibrium. But the question is, how can experimental governance achieve a good governance outcome if there is always a better outcome available at another point in time? So how it can be good if you can change it towards a better outcome later in time? So the other reason why I'm not necessarily convinced why experimentalist governance should bring about a good outcome is that it is probably based on an assumption that what the actors learn at the micro level, right, is ultimately good for society as a whole, right? But I'm left wondering, are what, energy companies or, financial regulators learn is really the best outcome for society, or there can also be distortions out there? So I was left with these questions in my mind. The second reaction I have is on time. And you also touch on time, but I think my understanding of time is a little bit different here. Because I think that time matters to address problems, okay? And, experimentalist governance is ultimately a framework to understand how policy actors react to problems, right? So, and timing can be very different. The time with which actors learn and then implement solution can be very different. I mean, sometimes you can have very quick solution, sometimes it takes ages. Let me give you an example from an area that I've studied a lot, the IMF adjustment program, or we can also use, the euro area adjustment programs during the euro area crisis. So here I think it's it maps beautifully into your idea of experimentalist governance because, in an adjustment program, at least for the IMF, so you have centralized rules, it's, in Washington it is decided how you have to undertake adjustment. Then you have staff IMF staff that on the ground have to implement these rules and devise the adjustment programs. Then there are the periodic reviews, and they get back to Washington when they change, the framework for adjustment programs. Now, I think that this is a very good case for timing, because in the 1980s, for the IMF, it took 2 decades to learn from the disaster of Latin America. They learned, but they changed, but it took them 2 decades. In the Euro area crisis, they were more quick in that. But so my question on time is, do we still have experimental governance if actors take a long time to learn and to respond and to undertake this periodic review that then change, the centralized elements? So how much time is relevant here? So can we still talk of experimentalist governance if it takes a decade or if it takes, months? I don't know. So what's the time frame here? My third point is about, this question of polyarchy, which I completely agree with you. I mean, I completely buy that. I mean, all systems, it's polyarchy. In your definition, no single actor is able to impose preferred solutions without taking account of other actors' view. I mean, ask my dean if he can take any preferred solution without asking, his colleagues' view, right? But I think that this scope condition, which I see the point, is still very indeterminate because it's very large. It basically applies to all democratic systems or to all systems where you accept democratic principles, right? Because in all these systems, you have, an actor that cannot take decisions on its own. So polyarchy is not yes or no. It's not a dichotomous variable, but it can be high or low, right? So if it's so big, as a scope condition, can it really help discriminate the cases in which you are likely to expect experimentalist governance, right? Because for me, if it applies to all cases, how can we know those cases that are relevant for experimentalist governance to emerge? And on this spirit, you mentioned China at the beginning of your lecture, right? Because you said, I'm starting thinking to explore experimentalist governance in China. And at this point, I'm curious why. I mean, China is one of those cases where I would expect this polyarchic assumption not to hold, right? Because in a non-democratic system, you have an actor that can impose its will. So how does China fit with experimentalist governance? The last reaction I have, it's again on scope conditions. And I was left wondering if you left implicit one of the scope conditions, right? Because for these iterative processes to take place, at least it seems to me that actors must somehow share the same intellectual reference points. The actors that are called to implement the rules and then, come up with the periodic reviews, they have to share kind of the same mindset. Let me give the example of the single supervisory mechanism because it's, of course, the case that I know more. We are talking about central bankers. We're talking about financial regulators. They share, a common mindset. They share, educational backgrounds. It's not by chance that they are called epistemic communities. So I was really wondering, but I think that also the same applies to your work on electricity, right? Where you have the regulators, the companies that share at least the common milieu. So do you think is it necessary to specify that for experimentalist governance, the actors need to belong to the same epistemic community, or it doesn't matter if they come from different communities or backgrounds? Although I think it would make things much more complicated, right? At least to implement rules and then come up with a common periodic review. So I think these were my 4 major points, but let me reiterate what I already said. I really want to thank Jonathan because I think he really has challenged our standard way to think about governance and policy making with you in the EU. And so I also want to echo what has been said. We are extremely delighted to have you here at the Scuola Normale for a while. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Manuela. Talking of about understanding of time, thank you for having understood the time frame. You had to ask your question without the need for hierarchical intervention from the center. So I trust that also David will be an experimentalist in a very positive and virtuous way.
I ask your help as a chair, because I'm a typical Italian, speaker that, can that in all the time. So please roll a little bit the time schedule. Yeah, first of all, I confirm, let's say, the incipit of Manuela's feedback. It's also a pleasure and an honor for me to be here and to some extent to celebrate also what Jonathan have done in last decades. Of course, my own, let's say, viewpoint is very much related to youth studies, and so I first thank you for the contribution provided on youth studies. And in that respect, I also ask the audience to allow me to also use some biographical notes, because, when you get older, also, talking about ideas, talking about theories, talking about analytical frameworks, it does not just mean that, but means also talking about events, meetings, exchanges, opportunities to listen to, top-level scholars like Jonathan. And, just coming to Palazzo Strozzi, I remember, let's say, I try to look back, when I met Jonathan the first time, and in fact it was more than 20 years ago, and it was in Fiesole. I was at the time a postdoc research assistant with Martin Rhodes, and basically you were preparing OMC in action together with Philippe Pochet and a bunch of colleagues and friends, especially in the Brussels kind of. And basically, it was a sort of premiere of one of the main, let's say, potential added values of your own reflection on the open method of coordination that at that time was, the brand new things everybody was talking about. And it was really for somebody like me coming from comparative studies, it was really something enlightening, talking about precisely what Manuela has just talked about, new modes of governance. At that time, everybody talked about. And Jonathan was one of, I would say, the most analysts of the dangerous kind of use of this governance. And in any case, I started that journey basically on studying European, precisely listening to kind of preparation and then later on follow-up. Then I followed all the different stages. Jonathan's contribution to studies, first in coming from North America, then going to Amsterdam, and then, looking at all the different kind of steps that he followed, especially in social policy domains, ones that I know more. And in that respect, my first, feedback is really very much related to the added value of your work. And I think that there has been, I would say there have been 4 major added values of what Jonathan has done. The first one is from a theoretical point of view. And I think that Jonathan has proved the importance of what are usually defined as mid-range theories in EU studies, coming from the typical struggle between functionalists, intergovernmentalists, and so on. Jonathan really, focused on what is called mid-range theories, some forms of constructivist kind of policy-making actors in Brussels that really contributing to show on European integration process. Second of all, from an analytical point of view, coming from policy analysis, I think that Jonathan was able to make, to renew a little bit the interest. Famous Hugh Gay-Claw distinction, powering and puzzling. Especially it's focused on puzzling. What's going on in terms of how we frame problems and solutions, and how the broad community of stakeholders, practitioners, policy, together, not just in terms of cooperation, but also in terms of conflicts, to basically frame reality. And that's something that sometimes we own reconstruction of contemporary politics. And that way, he has been able to shed light on the black box, not just of the European Union integration process, but I would say in transnational governance. And being here in Palazzo Strozzi, where there is a program in transnational governance, well, I would say this has been a major contribution to progress in knowing what's going on in transnational forms of. And finally, last but not least, also from a methodological point of view, John really contributed to improve our standard I have used, it's not a secret, I've used a lot materials from Jonathan's research in our own courses. One of the first, kind of feedback after reading your own contributions has been always, look at this because this is the smartest way of approaching you, especially in terms of methodological rigor. And Jonathan has always, taught us how to be rigorous. Usually the average, let's say, scholars working on EU, they do a couple of interviews, they read a little bit of documents, and then they produce something. By contrast, when you read even a policy paper, a policy report by Jonathan, you see, on average, 30 interviews, different rounds of interviews with kinds of stakeholders, policymakers, different targets, with a very, the methodological annex is quite, dense. And this is absolutely consistent with that from a methodological point of view. And, for instance, I learned a lot about the famous of, sources coming from direct, let's say, intervention in the policymaking process by a lot of stakeholders. Also with triangulation between different, really improve, the empirical. That said, there are still, I think, some question marks on what we have talked about and what Jonathan has presented this morning. The first one is analytical and to some extent methodological at the same time. And rereading things from Jonathan on experimentalist governance, it came to my mind an old kind of dilemma proposed by Josta Espin Andersen, something like 30 years ago. And it was about the dilemma about trees and forests. What we are looking at when we, try to analyze politics in general or phenomena. Are we looking at trees or are we looking at forests? Because it depends on, the target of your analysis, whether you emphasize some traits of political realities rather than some others. So basically, these methodological analytical decisions had an impact on the kind of processes that you look at. And, listening to Jonathan and reading much of the work by Jonathan, the issue is that, okay, Jonathan, you have been really, really, smart in analyzing, the daily work of technocratic bodies in Brussels, of communities, epistemic or of some other kinds, working on specific policy domains. But, have you been able to really, figure out what is the mechanic of the trees, or also providing the big picture of the forest we are looking at? There is still some questions that are especially analytically, logically, I would say, rounded. In the sense that being so much rigorous in an in-depth reconstruction of the daily work of bodies, transnational forms of governance, and so on, do you see the risk of being so much immersed in this dense empirical reconstruction, then we miss a little bit the overall dynamic of the forest. That's something that always, provide me, a lot of food for reflection, but also for doubt. A sort of risk of hyper-specialization in the analysis of very complex, dense phenomena that then, in the end, reduce a little bit our own capacity. And the second issue is also related, very much related to this, is about the assessment of change and stability. One of the major questions that we have in social sciences. And, again, kind of dense reconstruction, do you that it is to some extent running the risk of over-emphatization of the change potential? Same experimentalist governance. Because when you refer to a daily base changes, of course you see a lot of things happening. A lot of meetings, a lot of exchange, a lot of dialogue, a lot of, things happening on a day. But then is about, the capacity to learn, to our own understanding, to improve the puzzling exercises, or by contrast, there is an overemphasization processes. And in that respect, also the time dimension. Because when we use these kind of approaches to measure also, to assess change or stability, very much depends on the timeline. Are we comparing things in the last decade or 2 decades or 3? Depending on the way we frame from a temporal diachronic point of view, the evolution of experimentalist governance, you can probably go into 2 opposite kind of readings of the same. Sometimes emphasizing stability, sometimes. It was a sort of retrospective, let's say, reflection on the basis of what Jonathan has done in the last decades. Much contribution, I would say, to the progress of knowledge, some question marks. I also refer to the prospective, let's say, reflections on the base of this stimulating presentation by Jonathan. And here again, I see a lot of potential. First of all, in terms of the capacity to catch and describe the ongoing changes related to experimental governance. Again, you are talking about many things that are to some extent changes, because it seems that, first of all, policy challenges and problems are changing. And so, as a consequence, also, the way we approach from a governance point of view are changing. And this aspect of new forms of regulation in certain risks, that sounds extremely interesting in terms also of how our own policy instruments are changing over time. So from a descriptive and also analytical point of view, it seems to me to refer to the diagnostic kind of possibility in the same policy-making process. That is the background of policy analysis that is always part of the process, not just. At the same time, I still have, again, also in prospective terms, some questions. Yeah, 1 minute. The first one is about, again, I go back to ECLO, powering and puzzling. So we are talking about learning. You use a lot, the term learning processes. We learn from our own experiences, from our own mistakes. No, but what is the interplay between puzzling and powering? And in other terms, what is the room for a true learning and a true experimentation through? Because one could say, okay, if you look at, for instance, Pepper Cool Pepper and the idea of quiet politics, it seems that in the end, all these new forms of governance are a sort of quiet politics in disguise. We seem that it's an open room for reflection, for learning, for, sort of reflexive forms of governance. But in the end, you know, if you don't belong to the epistemic communities Manuela referred to, you are a little bit out of context, and your capacity to really make things change a bit at risk. And this is something that, for instance, through the permanent crisis, the perma-crisis we have gone through in the last decades, seems to be to some. Do we really understand and improve our knowledge about how to, you know, govern, for instance, economic? The base of the daily learning processes, cumulative, incremental, or by contrast is more a matter of kind of clashes, also from a political point of view and in terms of power struggle rather than in terms of reflection that make things happen. And last point, probably a challenge, another challenge, but I frame this in terms again of a question to John. About, okay, we are talking about new forms also of regulation related to new risks. At the same time, if we look, for instance, apologize, I always refer. We also see a sort of revenge of budgetary policy. So increased resources and the role of the financial framework of budgetary resources, the so-called fiscal capacity of the European Union in order to shape the process, the strategies for investment and things like that. That this sort of rediscovering of budgetary policy is just a temporary thing, or by contrast, it's something that could, you know, last for a while. And what does this mean from an analytical point of view for using the same? Can we apply shifting from regulatory to redistribution policy? That's all.
Thank you, David. I would give it the option, Jonathan, to answer some of this.
I think we should take open to the
You want already?
Yeah, I've written everything down. I would like, I mean, I think both sets of questions are great. Very extensive.
For what? So not to risk, in order not to risk not to have time for the floor, generously Jonathan, or generously or ungenerously, maybe it doesn't want to answer this one, it prefers to get some easier ones. I don't know. I don't know the intention, but it's a good idea anyway. So I see Luigi and Mario and Hans-Jörg.
And our students.
Also, students are allowed to, you know, there is no hierarchical governance here, so, you know, from the bottom, there is nothing to be scared about.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's very, very interesting. I have, well, 4 questions, but I put them very roughly, so not to take much time. They are interconnected questions. So, first question is, what is the actual novelty of this experimentalist governance vis-a-vis the traditional accounts of governance as made by actors that interact with themselves in a kind of horizontal way, not hierarchical? They are driven by uncertainty with knowledge and ideas. So a lot of stuff related to more traditional accounts of governments, epistemic community, and so on. So what is the actual novelty that you see in this phase? Second question related, what are the factors driving this change? Because the traditional account of governance sees it as the portrayal is that the situation, let's say, evolves by itself, in a sense, that it says there are many factors interacting, but it would be important to get whether there are actual drivers of the change, because this affects a lot the evolution of the system itself. In that sense, the Deweyan origin of experimentalism is, of course, it's important, but can be confounded in the sense that Dewey understood it as a democratic way of governing uncertainty. In this case, that might not be the case. For example, the penalty defaults go to the advantage of someone and to the disadvantage of others, possibly. So who are the drivers of this change? Third point, self-reinforcing or self-limiting. I believe that it may depend a lot on external factors. totally contingent. So in your scheme, it would be important to take into account external factors. And one example is the evolution of European food security policy vis-à-vis the war in Ukraine. Because up to that point, the main issue was related to climate change and something like that. And the war introduces new factors affecting, for example, the availability of the food chain across the world. So the total kind of a revision or return of autonomy and nationalism, if I may say in this way, quite quickly. So there are contextual factors totally unexpected that may alter profoundly the issue. So how to take into account in this scheme. Fourth and last point, regulation of a certain risk. Of course, this is a topic that affects me a lot. I think it's important. I would like to know your opinion about the need to take in consideration different types of uncertainty, because the reason why precaution is stalling is not by chance, but because the type of uncertainty involved in many issues has been changing. And so you can see it by looking at the stalling of precaution and the rise of preparedness. Again, the food security framework that the European Commission has established, this European mechanism for, I can't remember the acronym, food security and resilience or whatever. And this shows that uncertainty is not understood any longer as something related to precaution, to something that you don't know, but you know enough to plan in some way a way of react. And rather it is some type of uncertainty is related to total unpredictability, where it is absolutely important the quick reaction, the ability to react quickly. Sorry if I've been too...
Thank you, Jonathan. Three quick questions. What is the metric on which you assess the success of experimentalist governance? And methodologically, it would be interesting to have a comparison between the same issue, regulation of the banking sector or whatever, where you have a hierarchical system, and another place where you have an experimentalist arrangement, and look on the basis of a set of criteria which performs best or which is the less, which one is best able to reduce uncertainty, for instance. Connected to this, would you define the American financial regulation system as an experimentalist one? We had the great crash of 2008, which was a dramatic collapse of regulation. And this was a collapse because there was loose governance, clearly a very weak hierarchical governance system. So what are the dangers? The electricity system in Europe did not fare well facing the price spikes with the Ukraine war. And the countries which worked best were those, France and Spain, which introduced a price cap. And the inflation extended to a much lower extent to the rest of the economy, for instance. So, I'm curious about your judgment about these cases. And more generally, clearly, on this is beside the scope of this talk, but a set of normative questions, power, legitimacy, democracy, are clearly very important to define the context in which these experiences move.
And I have a question with regard to the openness and closeness of the experimental governmental designs, and which I think is not only a question of the design of experimental government, but openness can be also imposed from outside in the form of an enhanced public interest in the outcomes or in the procedures of experimental government. And here it seems to be the case that experimental government works well under conditions of relatively low salience and also low and issues that are of low public interest. So here my question would be whether there is any experience about what happens in cases of mediatization, which often means that there are enhanced conflicts and an enhanced public interest, and media logics come in which interfere in particular ways with deliberative procedures. They might impose particular goals. There might be particular media biases that come in, and so the question here is how do experimental government designs deal with such cases? On the one hand, it seems to be important to reach out, also for the generation of democratic legitimacy. On the other hand, there are these risks of interference.
Any other question? Curiosity? Criticism? Not yet. Not yet. Jonathan, so we have about 30 minutes for about 22 questions. And the floor is yours.
Okay. I'm mostly going to follow the order in which they were asked. First, which is what is really distinctive and novel about this form of government? Is that better? Is it something more than kind of horizontal, collaborative, network governance under conditions of uncertainty? And I would say yes, indeed. And really there are two crucial dimensions. One is the feedback from implementation to policy design and procedures, which tends to be more emergent, if it occurs at all, in classic accounts of network governance. And the second is a flexible form of formalization. So in order to, let's say, learn from implementation experience, you have to be able to define what it is that you're looking at. You have to be able to draw conclusions. You have to be able to make rules which may be subsequently revisable. But it's not a system of governance in which everything is fluid at the same time. I mean, I gave the example of, this systems which combine elements of synchronic uniformity with diachronic experimentalism. That's an extreme case, but there is always, making of rules, of metrics, and procedures which are formalized and which can also be linked to penalty defaults as in order to respond to actors who may not be willing to abide, for example, by collective binding decisions. And I think in that respect, experimentalism differs significantly from the classic accounts of informal network governance, just as it does from the classic accounts of bureaucratic or hierarchical governance. So I think that's an important point to stress. And then maybe I'm going to try to go quickly through the question, starting with Manuela's. Yeah, I mean, so the first thing to say is that, as was also the case with flexible specialization back in the day, we can think of this style of analysis as having a theoretical, an empirical, and a normative dimension. So sets out a kind of theoretical account of what we're looking at and maybe the conditions which we might expect to find it or might be possible to find it. We can then use these categories to analyze concrete cases and ask how well they fit the claims of the theory. That's the, let's say, empirical part. And then there's the normative dimension, because which has both a diagnostic side, which David mentioned. So if we see something empirically that does not fit the model or fits the model partially, you can make an argument about what would need to be changed for it to function in a more experimentalist way. I've just written a policy paper for a high-level group on the future of cohesion policy, asking about the governance and delivery model of the cohesion funds and how they compare to the recovery and resilience facility. And we're intervening using our research and conceptual tools in order to intervene normatively and practically policy debate. So yes, I do think for a variety of reasons, including the ones listed in the salient virtues of experimentalism, that experimentalism is in fact normatively positive and desirable. I agree. This is a disequilibrium or anti-equilibrium way of thinking. I think that's actually the characteristics of the world. I mean, not just of experimentalist governance as a theoretical approach, and we need to learn to live with uncertainty, not by suppressing it, but by adapting to it and pushing it in certain directions. Can we talk about something as being good? If it's provisional, there may be something better out there. I think absolutely certainly. And for that reason, most of the time I prefer to talk about good practices rather than best practices. I mean, sometimes in a policy argument, you have to say, well, look at what we currently take to be the best practices. But the Deweyan perspective, leads one to think that you should never assume that your current practices, I mean, even they may be better than what came before, they may be useful in some dimensions, but they're never going to be the best. And is it the case that what the local actors learn in experimentalist governance is good for society? I mean, I think that depends very much on the openness of the review of what the local actors are doing and the opening outwards to widening circles of actors. So one of the foundational ideas for experimentalism, which is also Dewey's own idea, is that in order to address, solve provisionally governance problems, you need to involve the people who experience governance itself. Dewey has a famous quotation and a famous line in The Public and Its Problems, in which he says, the person who understands where the shoe pinches is the person who's wearing the shoe. That doesn't mean that the person who's wearing the shoe can redesign the shoe. And there he talks about the need for collaboration between the shoemaker and the shoe wearer. And I think that's really very central. And I often think that the role of penalty defaults is not to close down, here responding to Luigi's question, it's not to, let's say, bring power of powerful actors back in through the back door to shut down discussion. It's rather a means of addressing the powerful actors who may want to subtract themselves from collective deliberation or implementing collective decisions. And here I can also respond to the point which David raised, and which anyway came up elsewhere, which is the relationship between puzzling and powering. And so, you know, it's certainly true that experimentalism is a form of governance which is focused on collective puzzling, and which tries to use the experience of practical application to advance collective problem solving. But I think that power also comes in, because it has been famously said, I think it was Carl Deutsch who said it, that power is the ability not to learn. So a powerful actor is someone who is able not to learn. And so sometimes in order to ensure that that's not the case, you need political mobilization. And so I see in that respect, powering can be at the service of puzzling by opening up closed policy processes and obliging dominant policy actors to take account of the perspectives of others. That's why polyarchy is important. I gave the small but interesting example of the drafting of the EU deforestation regulation, and there we can see very clearly that NGOs in particular, campaigning NGOs, were able to make a difference, also because of their linkages to actors in not only other DGs of the Commission, but also the European Parliament. So in order, first of all, to get the initial proposal from the Commission revised, and then if we look at the final enacted version of the regulation, it brings in much more the perspectives of these campaigning groups, and also the perspective of the producer countries. And the compromise, like most pieces of legislation, and so how it plays out will then depend on the further struggles over what it means to implement these benchmarking systems, what kinds of support is provided to prevent the exclusion of smallholders from exporting to the EU, and so on. So I see powering and puzzling not only as alternatives, although they of course can be, but also as complementary. But it's it's maybe an unusual way to emphasize the positive functions of powering for potential puzzling. The question of time, quick versus slow solutions. I thought you were going to say something different, which is what about crises? I mean, is there a kind of crisis emergency decision making which is not experimentalist? And that can indeed be the case, but I would distinguish between putting out a fire, which you have to do with the resources, physical and cognitive at any one time, and redesigning your fire prevention and fighting system, where the experimentalist dimension comes in. I guess I would say the sort of real question, I wouldn't define the IMF or the World Bank as experimentalist organizations, even if they do have some feedback mechanisms like the periodic reviews. And so there, I would say that the real questions are about what are the barriers to feedback from on-the-ground experience, and then equally, when these organizations do formally change their policies, what are the barriers to actually implementing it? So, Alex Kentakanis, he's a friend of mine, but I always have trouble with his Greek name, excuse me. And he says, yeah, well, you know, the IMF changes its policies, but if you look at the programs, they don't walk the talk to the same extent. I mean, whether that may be exaggerated, but it definitely draws attention to the linkages and mechanisms that we need to find between the upwards and downwards feedback within these organizations. Is polyarchy, since it's not a dichotomous variable, which I fully agree, none of the 4 scope conditions are dichotomous, and so indeed, if they vary too much on one direction or another, either you don't get experimentalism or you might get one of the architectures. But I think what I would want to emphasize is that the scope or possibility conditions for experimentalism are very broad. So in other words, there are very few places where I don't think that you can find experimentalism. To take up Hans-Jörg's question, I don't agree that we find experimentalism only in low salience, technocratic issues. Many of them are really high salience. That includes, as we see, your question about how to deal with mediatization is a good one. And I don't think I have a really good answer to it. I think it's a question in general, for example, about the European Union, that we look at how the public in general thinks about the European Union, how the European Union, let's say, actually works. There is not so much a democratic deficit, but a cognitive disconnect, and it's very difficult to bridge it, and the role of the media is part of the problem. So I would acknowledge that. In the study on pesticides, we speculate a little bit about whether our findings about what public preferences would be and how they would react if decisions were taken under the kinds of procedures that people say they approve, how that would work out when you transition to the real world of policy contestation, where being able to decide, where there are conflicting discourses, and we see this now on glyphosate, what does it mean to take all relevant studies into account? Which studies really count more? Does the EU currently have post-authorization monitoring? Is it systematic enough? And so there you have competing discourses, and that's very important. I don't have an experimentalist theory of public communication to pull out of my pocket to answer the question, but it's very much worth thinking about it. I guess we've run over time. I could go on. Okay, I will keep going. How does China fit? So what I wanted to say is not that I'm thinking of studying China, but there's actually a really large literature about policy experimentation in general and experimentalist governance in particular in China. It was developed or invented separately from the literature that I and my colleagues have worked on. There is a kind of historic connection. Dewey spent 2 years in China in 1919 and 1920 and profoundly influenced not only like the May 4th movement, but also Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. And, so particularly a German scholar named Sebastian Heilmann rediscovered this independently and, analyzed different forms of policy experimentation in China. He called it experimental governance. What I would say is that there does seem to be evidence that in the periods of opening up of the Chinese system, and of its reform. I would say up till coming of Xi Jinping, that we see that various forms of policy experimentation involving initiatives by local governments or testing ideas from central government locally do seem to have played a part in, let's say, the advances of the Chinese growth and regulatory model. There's always the question of how experiments are evaluated, who gets to evaluate them, by what criterion, and there, we can evidence that in an undemocratic society in which factional struggles within the ruling party are crucial, this can have quite a distortive effect on the evaluation of promising experiments. Actually, Xi Jinping was quite involved with environmental policy at the local level in China, and it turns out that wherever Xi Jinping was there, those experiments were very highly rated and turned into a model for others. And it certainly seems as if on this dimension, as on so many others, the system is has become progressively more shut down, top down, to the extent that there is experimentation is defined from the top. So here again, polyarchy does seem to be a very critical variable. I mean, I could go on with the questions. If I haven't answered them, it's not because they're not important. And I hope that we can continue, especially since the questions were all asked by colleagues who I hope to be seeing regularly, we can continue the discussion in the coming months and years. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody, for participating. This final China-EU comparison are particularly puzzling. Maybe Let the 100 flowers bloom was experimental slogan in before time, and Manuel José Barroso was a Maoist when he was young. So, you know, there are a lot of links I have to think about. I never thought about it before. But thank you, and certainly, yes, there will be an iterative process also in discussions about these themes of governance. I remind everybody that we have a lot of other activities on in this place in the next few days. Tomorrow, a day of discussions about first the history of the Banca d'Italia, and in the afternoon, related discussions about books about central banks and inflation, monetary policy, and so on. Whereas next week, same time, same place, another Carlo Azeglio Ciampi lecture with David Soskis. So the spirit of champion of the Bank of Italy is very present right now, and we'll try to make the most out of it. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Thank you, John.